2014, Washington, D.C. A woman named Shamika Young had fallen on hard times. The single mother with a mental disability and drug addiction would soon find herself and her 8-year-old daughter, Relisha Rudd, living in a homeless shelter. And it's here that this sad mystery would begin, because unknown to Shamika, an employee for the shelter would develop an unhealthy obsession with Relisha. This was 51-year-old janitor Khalil Tatum. Now Tatum was actually an ex-convict who, other than a few months between 2003 and 4, was in prison basically his whole adult life. Regardless, he had worked for the shelter and seemed to be fine except for one major issue. He was said to inappropriately fraternize with the shelter residents, something that was deemed unethical. Now how far he was taking this fraternizing, I'm unsure, but it seems like he may have been hooking up with some of the women there. And, maybe most frighteningly, he seemed to be interested in girls of a very young age. Which brings us to Relisha. He took an unhealthy obsession with her, and after a short period of time, he became her friend. Or at least, as much as a 51-year-old man can with an 8-year-old girl, buying her a tablet and then even taking her to see Disney on Ice after getting permission from her mother. But the worst was yet to come, because he would eventually convince Shamika to allow him to take Relisha back to his place, where allegedly he was going to bring her to play with his granddaughter. Now I couldn't find exactly what happened next, but I get the feeling that Relisha continued to live with Tatum. What is known is that at some point in February 2014, our mystery would finally begin, because the school where Relisha attended would contact her grandmother, who I'm speculating at this point was her legal guardian, although, again, I'm unsure due to the lack of records online. Anyways, the school was trying to find out where exactly Relisha was, because she had 10 unexcused absences, which automatically triggered an alert due to educational neglect. And her grandmother would tell the school that she was actually in the care of a Dr. Tatum. And obviously he was not a doctor, he was a janitor. And not to sound like a broken record, but again, I'm unsure how the doctor part of this story came about. In any case, the school official would finally trace Tatum down and contact him at a number that they had gotten for him, and they set up a meeting with him and Relisha. But Tatum did not show up. After this, the school wisely contacted the police to report her missing. But sadly, it had been 30 days at that point since anyone had last seen her. So investigators were starting off way behind. But they began the process of running down leads and witnesses, and they finally came across her last confirmed sighting. And it was on camera, and downright eerie. The first occurred at a Holiday Inn Express on February 26th, just a few weeks prior to the launch of the investigation, and it showed Relisha and Tatum were both walking down the hotel hallway. This would be followed 3 days later on March 1st, when Tatum and Relisha were seen again walking down the hallway of a hotel, this time a Days Inn. As bad as everything looked, at least detectives had a solid lead. They just needed to find Tatum and talk to him. But there was one problem. The last time he was seen was the day after he had been at the hotel with Relisha on March 2nd. And this time, he was spotted on security camera at a store, buying a shovel, lime, and 42-gallon trash bags. So police now feared the worst. And considering they were now looking at this footage weeks later, well, they knew they had to rush. That's when they came across another tragedy. Tatum's wife, Andrea, was found deceased in a motel due to a gunshot wound to the head. It happened the same day that Relisha was reported missing. It was all starting to come together now. Yet, police had no idea where Tatum was. But that part of the mystery was answered 11 days later on March 31st, when Tatum was found deceased in a shed at the park. He had ended his own life with the same gun he had used on his wife. But that leaves the bigger question: what happened to Relisha? Well, to most, the answer is obvious. But if she was murdered, where are the remains? To many, that has left open the possibility that maybe she wasn't murdered, and instead suffered an almost equally horrible fate. Some believe that her mother and stepfather sold her to a crime syndicate that would use her in awful ways I'm sure you can figure out, which seems possible when you take into consideration that even after the police got involved, her mother still did not want to report her missing. Interestingly, the DC investigators have ruled this theory out, although in an interview with the Washington Post, at least one senior law enforcement official stated that it was possible Tatum was exploiting her for money, and his wife found out, which led to him killing her and then himself. June 30th, 1999, West Alton, Missouri. A woman driving down an isolated section of the road along a cornfield would make a horrifying discovery. There, on the side of the road, lay a deceased body. The authorities were obviously called, and when arriving, they found this person was already kind of decomposed and was not identifiable. However, after taking fingerprints, the man's identity was soon confirmed because he was a former convict. His name was Ricky McCormick, a 41-year-old father of 4 who had chronic health issues stemming from his heart and lungs. Detectives looking at the case just weren't sure what had happened, as there was no obvious signs that it was a homicide, nor had any family members reported him missing. With so little to go on, police decided to make a timeline of events to see exactly what it was that Ricky had been up to the past few days. But unfortunately, the last time he had any known contact with someone was 5 days prior when he was getting a checkup at the hospital. Now this is starting off as a standard whodunit and why, but really, this mystery is so much more than that, because it's something else that the police found on Ricky that really sets this mystery apart when compared to ones in the past that we have covered. In his pockets were 2 notes, 2 coded notes, in which have never been deciphered, even after being studied by the FBI's cryptanalysis unit and numerous professionals outside the FBI. No one has ever been able to crack the code, which is unfortunate because the FBI believes that this note would probably explain where Ricky was in the days leading up to his death, and possibly could even point authorities to a possible motive, and maybe even a suspect, since by this point, his death was now believed to be a homicide. Now the contents of these notes are mysterious in their own right, but it's worth pointing out a couple of other things. First of all, Ricky was a high school dropout, and while that doesn't mean he wasn't capable of writing something this intelligent, it did add to the whole mystery, especially when his family came forward and stated that they had never known Ricky to ever write in code. They did state sometimes he would jot down notes that he called writing, but they believed it was nothing more than nonsense, and they believed quite simply he did not have the intelligence to craft one of the most perplexing codes in modern history. He was even diagnosed with severe cognitive issues from an early age, and he might have been schizophrenic. His mom would take it a step further and told investigators that the only thing he even knew how to spell was his name, although he did occasionally scribble. This was contradicted by other friends and family though, who stated he could read and write. Now what makes all this even crazier is that investigators never even told the family about these notes in his pockets, and instead, they found out about it on the news 12 years later when a local program was airing a segment about Ricky. They found this particularly strange since they had been told about everything else found on Ricky at the time of his death. And as far as his death goes, and the days leading up to it, he had been working at a gas station for 2 Palestinian brothers who had violent reputations, and investigators suspected Ricky might have been smuggling marijuana for them. In fact, he had made a random trip to Florida via Greyhound just 2 weeks prior, and his family stated he had become very paranoid after this. Could his employer suspected Ricky had double-crossed them in a drug deal, and they needed to do away with him? Well, there was another suspect that police looked at, another drug dealer right in the same neighborhood where Ricky lived, and his name was Gregory Knox. He actually ended up in prison for numerous other suspected murders, and apparently, he had even bragged about killing a black man working at a gas station. However, in the case of both suspects, investigators could never find that crucial piece of evidence. And as far as the notes themselves go, in its most basic description, it's a jumble of letters and numbers, occasionally set off with parentheses. And if you're thinking this is just some random doodling, you would be wrong, because law enforcement is confident that the code is hiding something. Interestingly, the notes have went on to become one of the top unsolved ciphertexts ever looked at by the FBI. They would even go on to post it to their website, asking for help from the public. And they were met with an overwhelming amount of responses from amateur code breakers. Yet, no one was able to crack it. But suggestions have ranged from VIN numbers to circuit boards, or shorthand for medication instructions. Others have even suggested it could have been tech support notes, or even gaming notes. However, most think now that it was not a ciphertext at all, and more than likely, just personal notes made by Ricky that only he could understand. Maybe just jotting down words as they sounded through his dyslexia. It could have just been clusters of letters and numbers for addresses, or even drop-off locations for drugs. In 1864, a little-known man named Eugene Aurot, a French slave friar, would travel to Easter Island where he was to begin his attempts at converting the locals to Catholicism. Little did he know, he would end up uncovering his own little mystery that, to this day, still confuses historians. It was actually on the 24th day of his 9-month stay that he would document something particularly interesting. He would note, quote, "In every hut, one finds wooden tablets or sticks covered in several sorts of hieroglyphic characters. There are depictions of animals unknown on the island, which the natives draw with sharp stones. Each figure has its own name, but the scant attention they pay to these tablets leads me to think these characters, remnants of some primitive writing, are now for them a habitual practice which they keep without seeking its meaning." End quote. Interestingly, this would not be written about again by Eugene. It was practically forgotten until 4 years later when the Bishop of Tahiti received a gift from the recent converts on Easter Island. Upon looking through the items, he found a small wooden board wrapped with fishing line and covered in hieroglyphic writing. The bishop, a Florentine Etienne Josson, knew the significance of the finding because this was a huge anomaly. There were no known writing systems developed anywhere at all in Polynesia. So what were these things? And why were they now just being discovered? Well, he would send a letter to a Father Hippolyte Roussel of Easter Island and ask him to collect all of these tablets, which were now known by the name Rongorongo, and to find natives that were capable of translating them. But they soon found out that the few natives they found that they thought were capable of translating couldn't agree on how to read them. Even stranger was there was so few of these tablets left. But Eugene had a thought on this. He would come forward and stated that during his time on the island, he had seen hundreds of these tablets. The problem was the islanders themselves. They paid no attention to them because anyone who could have read them originally were long deceased. So the items were used for other things. Sometimes they were simply used as firewood. So the vast majority of this unknown writing was gone. Which brings us to our next question. When was it developed? The question is key because it could answer the question if this was a totally organic system organized by the Easter Islanders, or if it was copied, perhaps after the Polynesians were first exposed to Latin. See, almost 100 years earlier, a Captain Gonzalez de Ajedo held a ceremony on the island where he basically announced that Easter Island and its inhabitants now belonged to Spain. In this ceremony, many of the island's chiefs were brought in. Here, they would actually sign the treaty which gave the island away, and their signatures resembled the Rongorongo glyphs discovered later on. And it's just possible that the inhabitants, upon seeing this Spanish document and numerous other Spanish documents, they could have been inspired to create their own writing system. This would actually also explain why there were no other documentation of the script before Eugene's visit in 1864, in spite of the fact The Europeans had found the island in 1722, but why could they find no islanders that could read it? Well, there's an answer for that too. Turns out, there were slaving raids going on at the time by the Spanish living in Peru. They came to the island and took many people, especially the more educated and elite of the islanders, the only ones who could understand the writing, and anyone left over from those raids who could interpret it most likely died of the resulting disease outbreak left after first contact with the Spanish, meaning this writing no longer had anyone on the island that could read it. And even crazier, it would also mean that the islanders created this complete hieroglyphic system after first seeing and being influenced by Latin. But maybe craziest of all, it would mean that this writing system was created and forgotten about all within the span of 100 years, which would be insane, and is the main reason that a lot of scholars do not believe that theory, and they instead insist that this system was most likely in place for close to 1,000 years, and was more than likely a proto-writing system, which only told very limited information, like hunting and animal movements, etc. Others have suggested that it's not even proto-writing, but more like a memory trick to remember navigation, astronomy, or agricultural data. Regardless of which, it's going to be almost impossible to prove due to the fact that such few texts exist. And also, the modern Rapa Nui language is heavily mixed with Tahitian and wouldn't even reflect what was recorded on the tablets. Unless you just happen to be a fan of 19th century Italian poetry, you have probably never heard the name Giovanni Pascoli. He is one of the most famous figures in Italian literature, right in between the late 1800s up until 1912, and he's one of the most famous poets ever, particularly noted for his ability to articulate the childishness in everyone. But there may be a reason he could tap into that inner child, maybe a dark reason, which goes to this next mystery, because it was on August 10th, 1867, when the Pascoli family were sitting at home, and they heard the horse-drawn carriage pulling up. They knew it was their father, Ruggero, who had just went to town. Ruggero was a successful man in his own right, being the administrator of the Lotori estate, a family of textile merchants. The Pascoli family would all run outside to see that their father Ruggero had returned, and they were met with horror, because inside the cart was the deceased Ruggero. He had been shot and slumped to the side, near the 2 dolls he had brought home to his daughters. Seemingly, someone, or multiple someones, had hit on the side of the road and fired as he drove by, and the horses, used to traveling this road, continued along. And it goes without saying, but 1860s police work in Italy wasn't the most advanced, and the case was never solved. The word leads, though. A man named Gino Vendamini, who would later become a politician, noted in his own memoirs that the assassins were well known to everyone except the authorities, implying that the locals remained silent out of fear, or maybe because they supported the murders. But who would have been behind it? That's the problem with this one. There's way too many potential suspects. Like, the local prefect pointed the finger at a political motive, because Ruggero had politically sided with the monarchist liberals, which upset some of the people on the right. However, the magistrate that was put in charge of investigating it believed 2 criminals known for hanging around the left-wing movement were responsible. But the majority of the public believed it was more likely that it had to do with his job as administrator of the Lotori estate. See, the farmers for the estate were actually involved in smuggling operations to get extra cash, and were working on the behalf of organized crime. Ruggero's duties involved making sure this exact thing did not happen, and he probably uncovered a major smuggling operation going on and put a stop to it, leading to an assassination that would serve as a warning to other administrators. In fact, other landowners at this time were targeted in mafia-style hits just like this. The Pascoli family, however, disagreed with all of these motives, and they instead believed 2 hitmen acted on behalf of a person who wanted Ruggero's prestigious position. Even Giovanni would later state it was possible that this man was even one of the hitmen himself. Regardless, with no witnesses ever coming forward, there was no way to say for sure. Hey y'all, you know what time it is. It's the Small Mystery Roundup, where we take a look at some mysteries that don't have a lot of info or just aren't deserving of a long segment. This time, we have quite a few mysteries, so the roundup is a bit longer than normal. So, let's jump on into it. Francis Bacon is a name I'm sure most of you are familiar with. The noted English philosopher and statesman served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England under King James between the years of 1613 and 1621, but he's known more for his contributions to science, especially when it comes to his influence on the scientific revolution. But could he be influential in a way that most people would never consider? I'm of course talking about the occult. Apparently, there's been a long-held theory of this, and it's multi-layered and kinda all over the place, but we'll touch up on a few tidbits. First of all, is his said connection to the Freemasons, which is often tied up with the fact that he would meet with these men at a local inn where they would discuss politics, philosophy, and share ideas. Although I cannot find a source on who these mysterious men were and what group they were tied to, but it's always been alleged they were some sort of secret society. Then there's his connection to the Rosicrucians, another sort of secret spiritual movement in the 17th century. Bacon was also known to host banquets that were attended by some of the most important men of his time. This included scholars, authors, scientists, lawyers, diplomats, and foreign dignitaries. Next is the idea that we sort of touched upon in a previous video, the true authorship of Shakespeare. This is a big conspiracy which alleges that Shakespeare, if he existed, only wrote some of his works, or maybe none of them, and instead they were written by many other writers, or perhaps just one. In this case, our one is Francis Bacon. But there's even more, as some people believe that Bacon actually faked his own death. The theory states that after years of secretly funding the Freemasons and other secret societies, and funding a series of plays that he wrote under a pen name, Bacon ended up in a huge amount of debt, a debt that he could only escape by faking his death and spending the rest of his life living under a disguise while he traveled through Europe. He may have even continued to write up until 1670 using the name Comte de Gabalis. However, none of this has ever been proven. The odor of sanctity is allegedly a sweet floral perfume that legends insist surrounds the bodies or relics of holy men and women. In some of the earliest documents from the beginning of the church and all the way up through medieval Europe, this fragrance is described as unearthly, a mingling of rose, jasmine, and incense that defies decay and hints at the soul's triumph over the tomb. According to the tradition, the odor often appears at the moment of a saint's death or during veneration of their remains. Witnesses speak of entering a dank crypt or a cramped cell and being struck by a sudden rush of sweetness so intense that you can't smell the normal decay. Skeptics, though, don't believe it and chalk it up to natural perfumes or well-tended flowers. Yet, in countless accounts, the scent persists even when no blooms are present, even when the air is cold and still, with some people even claiming that the scent is strong enough that it drifts down hallways far from the chapel or crypt. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1957, of Old Saybrook, Connecticut, retired teacher Mary M. Starr was jolted awake by an otherworldly glow beyond her bedroom window. Just waking up, she at first mistook the radiant orb for a downed aircraft, but as she drew closer, she realized this was no wreck. Suspended above her clothesline was a silent craft. Through the vessel's broad square windows, she seen two entities drift past one another. Their forms did not seem to be earthly. It had no arms, instead ending in smooth stumps, with transparent cubic heads glowing with ruby cores, and rubbery torsos flaring outward. No legs were visible, but their slender silhouettes suggested they were around 4 foot tall. As her heart raced, the windows themselves blinked out of existence, leaving the whole of a senseless expanse of polished metal. From the object came a shimmering antenna, spiraling skyward before the entire surface of the craft rippled into a soft incandescent glow that bathed the yard in surreal light for several trembling minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it reversed. The hull's luminescence dimmed, the antenna retracted, and the object executed a series of looping maneuvers over the neighborhood rooftops. It then shot straight up into the sky, vanishing from sight. So what was it? Since this was during the Cold War, an experimental military aircraft can't be ruled out. Or maybe it was something like ball lightning, but it's just as likely this was a sleep hallucination. Let's say you were playing two games. Game A is straightforward, a single coin toss that favors the house, offering you a slim chance of victory and a larger chance of loss. Play long enough, and that sad edge will grind you down. Game B cranks up the complexity, making your odds depend on the very coin flips you've already faced. If your current balance is a multiple of some number, say 3, you're handed a heavily biased coin that leans against you. Otherwise, you will get a slightly more forgiving one, meaning in both cases, you will likely lose. Here's where the paradox lies. If you alternate between Game A and Game B in a fixed pattern, or even choose between them at random, the combined process flips from losing to winning. The secret lies in how the losing trends of one game bleed into another, breaking the steady drift toward ruin and instead nudging the overall balance upward. Mathematicians trace this reversal to subtle correlations. Game B's state-dependent coins create pockets of opportunity that Game A's losses help reset, preventing the system from sticking in deep losing cycles. It's as though each game pushes you toward the other's strengths, crafting a balance that no single play could achieve on its own. Not really a mystery, but an interesting concept nonetheless. Samuel Taylor Coleridge was an English poet in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His most famous work may be The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which gained some fame among heavy metal fans after a song of the same name appeared on Iron Maiden's Power Slave. But it's not that poem that is the center of our next mystery. Instead, it's the poem called Kubla Khan, which Coleridge composed one night after an opium-influenced dream. The poem itself is not important to our discussion. Instead, it's what happened during the writing of the poem. After waking up from this dream, he quickly grabbed his pen and paper and began writing before he could forget it. But right at that moment, a man showed up and knocked on the door of Coleridge's home. This man would tell him he was from Porlock and was there on business. This man, who was never identified, kept Coleridge tied up for about an hour while he rambled on. Before he finally left, Coleridge would rush back in to jot down the rest of the poem, and he had already forgot most of the dream, other than just a few lines. The mystery, of course, is, who was this man that caused Coleridge to forget the major parts of this dream, which he intended to capture in a poem, thereby leaving it forever in a fragmentary form? The most likely theory, at least postulated by later writers, is that Coleridge simply could not finish the poem and created the story to not only explain why it wasn't finished, but to create this aura of strangeness around it. Other theories suggest he was simply a neighbor or peddler, or perhaps a hallucination caused by the opium. Usually, when it comes to unsolved crime, in particular, murders, we do deep dives. However, in this next one, there's not much info available due to a few circumstances. First of all is the name, the Pittsburgh Serial Murders. See, this Pittsburgh is in California, not the Pittsburgh that everyone knows, which of course really hinders a Google search. Secondly, the crimes came in 1998 and 1999, at a time when the city was already suffering through a really high crime rate, sorta masking the fact that this serial killer was on the loose. Finally, is the pattern itself, in which I mean, there's not one. Unlike the cliche where the killer has a particular type of victim or a very distinct MO, in this case, there was nothing like that. The first victim was a 27-year-old, Michael Tan, whose remains were found in a ditch on November 9th, 1998. He had been beaten and drowned. This was the only male victim, and the only one who did not live in Pittsburgh. Interestingly, his relatives and friends all stated he didn't even know anyone from the area, which makes it stranger. Although, in his case, it's likely he walked into his apartment during the middle of a robbery. 5 days later, the remains of a 15-year-old, Lisa Norell, was found near a local business after being reported missing 8 days prior. She had been strangled. Then, fast forward a few weeks later to December 5th, and a 27-year-old sex worker, Jessica Frederick, was found stabbed to death, followed 8 days later by 32-year-old Rachel Cruz, who had a drug addiction and was frequently in the company of other sex workers. This one sticks out because, not far from her murder, another sex worker was badly assaulted but survived. She would describe the attacker as a Hispanic male with a dark Chevy Monte Carlo. The attacks cooled off for a month, but on January 8th, 1999, the body of 27-year-old Valerie Schultz was found in a ditch. In Valerie's case, she had been a sex worker about 4 years prior and had even moved away from Pittsburgh, and she had actually just came back for this 1 week when she was murdered. She had been staying in a motel, and witnesses described a Hispanic or Samoan male between 30 to 40 driving a faded brown car with a noisy muffler picking her up. So what do we have here? 5 murders, 3 on sex workers, or former sex workers. 2 seem to be completely unrelated, while 3 of the 4 were committed by different methods, although the method in Valerie's murder was never disclosed. Now what's crazy is, in spite of how random and unrelated these look, investigators are confident all 5 were committed by the same individual, which suggests they must have some kind of DNA proof. In fact, DNA would be used to rule out one suspect in 2001, while there have been at least 4 other suspects that have been ruled out over the years. My guess is this one is eventually solved. In the spring of 2011, Pittsburghers of Pennsylvania began stumbling upon a very peculiar sight: plastic protractors, those curved relics of geometry class, and they were glued to mailboxes, benches, and bridge railings across the city. At first glance, they seemed like random tokens just kinda left about, but upon closer inspection, each one of them was stamped with a bold number and painted in hues of cobalt, crimson, emerald, and lavender, as if someone were secretly counting the city's hidden corners. No 2 placements told the same story. Some protractors sat high up on a lamppost, others clung to the underpass, their arcs echoing the steel bridges above, superglued into place, inviting passerbys to wonder who would painstakingly place these in such odd locations. University of Pittsburgh alumnus Eric Legee took up the quest to chronicle their spread, mapping nearly 500 of these silent markers between 2011 and 2013. His chart revealed no grand design. There was no spiral, no cryptic messages, just clusters that hinted at aimless paths and sudden leaps from one neighborhood to the next. The numbers climbed into the mid-400s, yet their sequence stubbornly refused to reveal a single pattern. Speculation swirled. Was this the art project of a citywide tagger, or a frustrated mathematician, or something else altogether? Today, most of the protractors have disappeared, removed by city crews, or carried off by souvenir hunters, leaving this little mystery unsolved. Alright guys, that's the end of the small mystery roundup. Before we get back to the video, I just wanted to remind you, if you like the channel and would like to support it, please check out the YouTube memberships or my Patreon, which is linked in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video. Summer 2003. A random sonar survey at the Sea of Galilee in Israel would make a very interesting and intriguing discovery. Looking over the results, they came across a huge monumental stone structure about 30 feet beneath the waves. It was built in a cone shape made of basalt boulders. The whole thing was estimated to weigh about 60,000 tons. It stands about 32 feet high and has the diameter of about 230 feet around, about twice the size of Stonehenge. From first observations, it seemed like the rocks had been piled up on top of each other like a giant rock cairn. But divers were sent down to get a better view and soon found out that the boulders showed no signs of cutting or chiseling, meaning whatever reason they were here was probably not ceremonial in purpose, as similar structures have been found around the world to mark burials, and usually have some kind of markings that identify it as such. However, one thing was for sure, it was man-made. In fact, it probably had been built on land before the water in the Sea of Galilee had risen. Even stranger, it is believed to have been constructed a long time ago, maybe around the 3rd millennium BC, basing that on the fact that a few other megalithic structures were found nearby. Actually, just a mile south of this structure was an ancient city called Bet Yura, or Khirbet Kurek, one of the biggest cities in the ancient world. It was pretty advanced too, having paved streets and towering defenses. If the structure really is 4,000 years old, then it was likely built by the people that lived here. However, the reason for doing so is still unknown. The most common theory is that it was a ceremonial site of some kind, or a communal burial site, and then was submerged by rising waters in the lake. Others suggest that it was actually built inside the water and was probably constructed as some type of fish nursery, or possibly a boat ramp, although I just can't see either of those last two theories as being the reason. That brings us to the conclusion of this installment of the Mega Unsolved Mysteries Iceberg Explained. We are now about halfway through layer 10. Hopefully, my code wasn't too distracting and you guys still enjoyed the video. Goodbye and good night.